Hi, everyone. So today we are going to be looking at Mesoamerica. So we remember that Mesopotamia is the land between rivers, and so Mesoamerica will be the land between the Americas. And we're going to look at three groups. So we'll look at the Maya, the Aztecs, and the Inca. And really, this is covering, almost 1,300 years in Mesoamerican history. So the Maya and the Aztecs are pretty much in modern day Mexico. The Maya kind of start off here. The Aztecs will take this land eventually over. So let's start with the Maya. They're going on at around all the way back in 200 to 900 CE. Let me grab a better piece of chalk. So in modern Mexico, there's no real Mayan empire per se. They are kind of a group of city-states. So they wouldn't have what we call a centralized government, but rather they would be a series of states that are all kind of in conflict with each other. And, there's a lot of warfare. And so at any given point in time, some states may be more powerful than others. In modern terms, it's what we would kind of call a confederation or kind of loosely associated states. Now, in each of these, you would have a ruler or governor, and they would claim that they have divine authority. In all three of these areas, religion is going to be extremely important. And so to say that they had divine authority meant that they had, the authority from the gods that they believed in, that they would be chosen to rule. And one thing that I want you to think about throughout this is the similarities that we see between these Mesoamerican states and what we've already learned about. This idea of divine authority sounds familiar because of the mandate of heaven that we see in the Chinese dynasties, that, their religious figure had chosen them to become rulers. And so religion is super important. They are polytheistic, which we know means believing in many gods. And as such, their priests would have a ton of power. This kind of leads to my next point, which is that they had a really rigid hierarchy. They had a social class system that was really strict, with priests near the top of it. Because they had so many gods, they needed, religious figures to interpret what those gods wanted. And so priests were up there at the top of the hierarchy. One association that we see with the Maya that we will later see with the Aztecs is the idea of sacrifice to the gods, specifically human sacrifice. The Maya, the Aztecs would both use prisoners of war as human sacrifices to the gods in order to appease them. They would offer these sacrifices up as thanks for, the expansion of their state or empire, or, as thanks for a bountiful harvest or whatever. And so the Maya, through this strict hierarchy, through a pretty impressive tax system, were able to find and develop a lot of really impressive achievements. They had mathematical achievements, they had astronomical achievements, but what we kind of most associate with them is their development of a really impressive calendar. And so, as you can see, this 700-year area is pretty impressive. And eventually the Maya will fall. We don't know a ton. We assume that there was possibly drought in the area that led to starvation, as well as, you have such loosely configured states. There was probably some civil war and war from other areas that would eventually lead to the decline of the Maya. Now, it will be another 300, 400 years before we get to the Aztecs. The Aztecs pretty much take over the same area in modern Mexico, but they will be from 1200 to 1500 CE. So like I said, there's a 300 gap of decentralization, of fighting, of struggling to form societies. But once the Aztecs come about, they will be an actual empire. They will be run through a central government. They will have an emperor, and they will expand through conquest. So they will continue to build upon this area. Eventually, with a city in pretty much modern Mexico City called Tenochtitlan. That was a butchering of that pronunciation. But it's this really impressive city that has this awesome irrigation system that they had developed, they had adapted, due to the environmental factors within the Aztec Empire. Let me write down that city. Tenochtitlan. One of the most impressive cities in the Americas during this time period. You have European travelers who would come over who would just rave about this place. They had never seen anything like it. Between the ziggurats, these monuments to the gods, pyramids, as well as this really elaborate marketplace, they had just never seen anything like it. And so they used some of the things that they had learned from the Maya to develop this area. They also have a very rigid hierarchy with very specific class systems. But one thing that we associate the Aztec with is the idea of a tribute system. And the tribute system is what we associate a tribute with. So as the Aztecs expand, they would, demand certain things from the areas that they had conquered. Generally, this was a tax or tribute that the conquered state would pay to the preservation and expansion of the empire. With all of this income, the Aztecs were able to develop these irrigation systems. They were able to maintain Tenochtitlan because they had this really significant essential tax system. And And they also carry things over from the Maya. They are also polytheistic. And they will also carry on the tradition of sacrifice. It's a little bit easier to pay your taxes when the idea of human sacrifice is brought up. So we already see very clear similarities and differences between the two places. One thing we need to keep in mind is that these traditions of sacrifice, specifically within the Aztecs, they may have been exaggerated over time. What we talked about yesterday was that hip analysis. So as we read documents, as we take in new information, we have to consider the source. And so a lot of what we know about the Aztecs comes from the Spanish conquerors that took over the empire. And generally, those Spanish conquerors want to brag about what they've done. They make the Aztecs seem, not necessarily more advanced, but more deadly, more ruthless with human sacrifice. And so always keep that in mind with these sources. Things may be exaggerated over time. Speaking of the Spanish, how do the Aztecs decline? Let me move this forward a little bit so you can see the Inca a little better. So how will they decline? It's a few different things. One is, really, they expand really quickly. They have this really elaborate system for expanding their empire. And when you expand too quickly, it becomes too difficult to maintain your empire. As a result, you have a lot of resentment from the conquered people. You have more rebellions and more uprisings. And so already the Aztec are weakened and fragmented when the Spanish arrive. And so as the Spanish come over to the Aztec Empire, it is pretty easy for them to conquer the Aztecs. It doesn't take long. They do this through warfare, but far more deadly, they will do this through disease. So these three things play a role in the fall of the Aztecs. So while the Aztecs are going on over here in Mesoamerica, at the same time, we have the Inca. And the Inca are all along this western coast of South America, kind of in modern Chile. Okay, so here we have the Inca. Modern Peru, all along this coast. And so I'm going to write about the Inca over here in Africa. Inca are pretty much going on at the same time period, roughly 1200 to 1500. And they will develop their area very similarly to the Aztecs, but for slightly different reasons. So with the Inca, we see a lot of conquest. We see the very quick conquering of new areas. But the reason that they do this is because of something called ancestor veneration, which we remember from other areas. Ancestor veneration is that deep, deep respect for previous generations that have conquered other areas. And so the Inca take this to a totally different level. what they believed was that once your, ancestors had died, they still ruled over whatever area they conquered. They still played a significant role in your life, in the development of your empire. And so the Inca felt that they didn't truly own any territory unless they went out and conquered it themselves. And so they really did this conquering, over 300 years, they take over a ton of area. And then once they conquer the area, it's pretty easy for them to control it. They have what we call a MITA system, M-I-T-A. The MITA system is similar to the tribute system that we see with the Aztecs. Basically, instead of monetary tax, the conquered Inca would have what's kind of like a labor tax, meaning that a month, 2 months out of the year, they would go and work on large-scale projects that the Inca wanted to do. And so these conquered people would be forced to, work on these big projects. As a result, you have one of the most impressive road systems in the world during that time period. The MITA system helps to develop these really, really impressive roads. And, they use things like centralized rule, but the MITA system allows them to develop things like this, as well as also have other really impressive achievements. They have two different things. So Quipu, Q-U-I-P-U, and Waru, W-A-R-U, are two Inca developments that very much are connected to the environmental context within which the Inca lived. So what I mean by that is the Waru, for instance, was this form of agriculture that would be kind of floating, farm beds, grass beds, and they would essentially use the water in times of drought. Quipu is this form of record keeping of writing based on knotted rope, which they had in abundance. Between these two, we know a lot about the Inca and how they operated. Similarly to what we've discussed, religion is extremely important. We have this ancestor veneration. We also see something called animism. Within the Inca Empire, the essential belief that the natural world and the religious world are very interconnected, and it's a faith in the earth. It's a faith in your connection between your ancestors and modern day. As a result, very, very polytheistic. Many different gods and spirits that the Inca believed in. So, like these other areas, we find similar reasons for their decline. Too much conquest over a relatively short period, civil war within these places, and eventual disease brought on by Europeans. So to conclude, think about the changes and continuities that you see in these areas. I mean, even from the world over, in China and Africa, we have things like ancestor veneration and animism. We also see similar levels of centralized bureaucracy between the Islamic caliphates and China, as well as the idea that you have divine authority to rule. But we see very significant changes as well, adaptations to the environment that you're in. this tribute system, this Mita system, they end up developing these really impressive roads. And, you can make a connection between the taxes that the Song dynasty did, but really the Aztecs and Inca had really made this more efficient system. Okay, so as you look through this, continually think of, well, what are the changes and continuities that I'm seeing between these areas as well as other areas?